I'm going to go straight L.A. Marzulli on you. And I guess I want to know your take on like the Nephilim narrative and its connection with modern day cryptids, UFOs, and or even transhumanism.
Okay.
And are we witnessing a return of the days of Noah, in your opinion?
That's a great question because, and there's a lot to say about it. I going back again, I got saved in 1993 and, I'm 18 years old. I'm a young, foolish kid. And, but soon after that, I began to I love the Bible, love the Bible, love the Bible. And I began to listen to, as most people, a guy named Chuck Missler. Okay. And, so one of the things that he was very good at was expository teaching. He would just pick a book and I would go through the book with him. And one of the books that I had almost all of his commentary sets on audio tape. And at night, I worked at night all night long. I would put the headphones in and I would just listen. And one of them certainly came across was Genesis 6. And just reading it in a straightforward way. And now, in seminary and others, I learned Hebrew and Greek and other things. And so now having the ability to look at, this in the original language, I can tell you that it is not unclear. It is so crystal clear. And what I find fascinating about it is that, when you outline it out, and I had the chance of joining with LA, he wrote a book called Countermove. And so he had asked me to write a chapter in the book. And so people can find it if they search my Mondo Gonzales Academia page. They'll find it there. It's called a brief look at the pre and post flood origins of the Nephilim. And so I went kind of a deep dive in that paper and outlined the text and blocked it out in English, but I did my own translation and everything. But all I'm saying is that it shows you crystal clear that you're introduced to these sons of God, which I know in the New Testament, that language can refer to human beings. But nowhere, not a single time in the Old Testament is that language used of a human being. It's just not. You have that in Genesis 6:2, 6:4, Job 1:6, Job chapter 2, verse 1. So you have Job 38, 6 and 7. So you have this very specific B'nai Ha Elohim, this phrase. And it's super easy. This isn't rocket science. Super easy. Highlight the passage, right click and search, and you'll find it. So this language does not, again, that phrase only appears and it only refers to non-human beings. Okay. Call them angels if you want. That's not exactly precise under the Old Testament. So I describe all that in there. But so what you have is, and in reality, this begins in Genesis 3:15, which we often call, and Gary Stearman has written a lot about this as well, my partner here as a co-host, about the seed war. And it's very clear in Genesis 3:15 that God is speaking, and he's speaking in this sense to Satan. And he says, there's going to be enmity between you and the woman, and between Satan's seed and the woman's seed, zerah in Hebrew. And so it's interesting that most scholars, all scholars would say, what's that referring to? And they would say, well, ultimately, this is the first time that you have a presentation of the gospel, so to speak. They call it the proto-evangelium, the first mention of the evangelical good news, in that a redeemer is going to be coming from the seed of the woman. Okay. And most people say that's going to be Jesus. Okay. Jesus is a human. Luke chapter 3, we see his genealogy there. But what you see there in parallel is the seed of the woman, which is Jesus, and zerah is a word that refers to sperm. It refers to seed. It can refer to offspring, your seed. But they're very clear. It's the seed of the woman. It's the offspring. It's the physical seed of the woman, which seems odd, right? Because women don't have seeds. They have eggs. Okay. But that's kind of makes it even more interesting. So the parallel would be then that you're going to have the offspring of the woman in a physical way, but that you'd have offspring of the serpent in a physical way. And of course, we know in First John, again, that's getting to a different book, but First John describes those who are children of the devil versus children of God, and no doubt that is in reference to spiritual offspring. Okay, but again, I don't want to read the theology of John, which was way later back into Genesis. So we need to let the Bible say what it says. Okay, so if you follow Genesis 3:15, you come to Genesis 6, where these non-humans, these non-sons of Adam, because that's what it says. It says the sons of God saw the daughters of man. So now you have a genus there. They saw the daughters of man, and that they were beautiful. It doesn't say the daughters of Seth or the daughters of Cain, which is the typical Sethite view. It doesn't call the sons of God Seth. Has nothing. I mean, people bring this up and you're like, you're reading into the text. It does not say any of that. You're forcing it. Okay. Well, then you see this again, Genesis 6 narrative where you have in seed form, these non-human beings coming down and mating with human women and producing these offspring, which are called Nephilim. And in Michael Heiser, in his book, Unseen Realm, he has a whole chapter on this, which I would encourage people, they want to get to the nitty gritty on it. When you get into some of the Hebrew grammar and Hebrew morphology, it can be pretty technical. But in that book, he says the typical idea is that the Nephilim comes from the Hebrew word nephal, which means fallen ones. But that is not what it means. It actually comes from an Aramaic derivative meaning giant. Okay. So you see this if you translate it, if you look at the Septuagint version, which is the Greek translation, in 275 BC, they use the word giant. So all that to say, let's follow the pattern for a moment. Genesis 3:15, you have a seed war introduced. Genesis 6, you have these fallen non-human entities coming down, mating with human women, producing these hybrid offspring, which that's all it says. They were there before and after the flood. Well, then the flood happens and allegedly all of them drown, which I have no problem with that. The text is pretty clear that all of anything that had the breath of life, it says over 50 different superlatives in Genesis 6 through 8, that everything drowned and died. Well, then in Genesis 14, now all of a sudden you have the Rephaim appear. They're in the land of Bashan. These are clearly in the books of Moses from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Rephaim always refers to a physical giant, okay, physical hybrid. And they appear in Genesis 14 out of nowhere. Okay, well then you don't see anything more until you come to the Israelites go down into the land of, they go down to Egypt. They're there for, centuries. On their way back, of course, they spy out the land and they see the Nephilim, Numbers 13:33. Oh my, the Nephilim are here, and the whole land of Canaan now is filled. So Bashan is northeast. What we understand is the Golan Heights today. The whole land is filled. So what is Satan doing? He's filling the land with these hybrids in order to thwart God's plan of giving the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. Okay, it's pretty clear. So in Genesis 12, God says, Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. And now over the centuries, it gets filled with Rephaim.
And,
so
the geography is kind of, it's not, you say it's the Golan Heights which is what's there. Mount Hermon. So
what you see there, Bashan is right. I mean, Mount Hermon is right there. And so, of course, we haven't even brought up Enoch yet, because some people get freaked out if you bring up Enoch, okay? I'm just staying with the text. So let's just stay with the text for a moment, the biblical text, okay? So you have all of this happening. Of course, they see the Nephilim there. They freak out. Well, then they respond with doubt. Now, fast forward 40 years in the wandering. They're coming back. One of my favorite passages, and I encourage people to look at this. Again, we were asking about the foundation here, and that is, if people read Deuteronomy chapter 2 and 3, Moses is recounting to them, he's on Mount Nebo, and they're getting ready to go on the land, and they're getting ready to fight all these giant clans, these Rephaim clans, these Anakim clans. And he says, oh, okay, by the way, as we were coming down, from the Kadesh Barnea area, we're coming south, and then we're going east, and we're coming up, the Dead Sea's here, they're coming up around, and they're going to cross over into the land to where Jericho is, right? Well, he says, oh, well, hey, the Zamzumim were living over there in Mount Seir and in Edom and Moab, but God killed them in times past. You didn't need to worry about them. Oh, then you have the Emim and the Zamzumim. You have all these names, and God's like, oh yeah, God killed those before. You didn't need to worry about those giants, all tall and giants. Okay, so the whole area now is filled, but God had already taken out many of them already, and Moses is just recounting this as being history. But he says, this time, I'm going to use you, Israel, and I'm going to use you to kill and destroy all these other Nephilim, Anakim tribes in the land. So you have this big battle in the book of Joshua. And we see in Joshua chapter 11, verses 21 through 23, that Joshua is doing so well with the Anakim that they flee. They flee west out of the land, escaping and trying not to die. And they land where we understand mostly are the Philistine cities, the 5 Pentapolis cities, Gath and Ekron and Ashdod. And so you just see Gaza, no doubt, all of them there. You see them listed. Well, then you don't see anything with the giants for several centuries, at least written. They're still on the land because 1 Samuel 17, we get introduced to this guy from Gath named Goliath.
Yeah. Right.
and so, and his brothers and his
still around somewhere.
They're still around. So this is the history of what you have. Again, we haven't mentioned Enoch really even once in all this. This is the history biblically of what you have in the story. And then really after the book of Samuel, you don't really see the giants appearing, at least living anymore in the biblical record. Later, what we do see is in the writings of Josephus. He's writing around 90 AD or so, first century. And he talks about, oh, the giants, the bones of the giants are here to this day on display. Wow, look at that. So it's in the Bible. It's there. It provides a background of this long war. And so all that to say, when Jesus says in Matthew 24, that the days of the Son of Man, his return, will be like the days of Noah. Don't read this like a 21st century American Christian. We read a sanitized version. Think of it as Jesus is there in the first century and the bones are over there. Josephus tells us. In their backdrop, in the second temple period, you have, of course, we know this now from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's lots of writings, massive milieu of writings and histories, and the book of First Enoch was there. And so Jude 1 verse 6 and 2 Peter 2:4 both give reference to this understanding right out of the book of Enoch. I mean, we know the Jude chapter 1:14 quotes Enoch. So the book of First Enoch. So there's no doubt Peter and Jude are relying on this book at providing some level of connection to historical, at least understanding. Whether the whole book of First Enoch is history or not, people can debate that. But what we can't debate is that the New Testament writers were speaking into a culture that understood that as the background. The whole Sethite theory didn't come until the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
Right. They knew the book of Enoch.
Absolutely. It'd be like if me quoting, Tolkien today, right, or, giving a quote from Gandalf. I'm not quoting it as necessarily scripture, but if I made a reference, well, Gandalf says, and they'd be like, and they saw the connection there, they would understand, oh, it's, who? I mean, some people might say that, but if you quoted, and I did this in one of the classes one time, one of our Sunday school classes, I said, look at the language that Peter and Jude are using. Chains, eternal chains, darkness, Tartarus, all of these. I said, where's Peter getting this information from? And then I went through the book of First Enoch and I pulled out all of these exact same phrases and put them side by side. And I go, where's Peter getting it from? He's getting it clearly from the book of Enoch, and he's putting it in inspired scripture. So to me, do I believe Enoch is inspired scripture? No, I don't. There's a lot of challenges with First Enoch, but nevertheless, they quoted it and they referenced it and they made allusions to it because that was the understanding of the time. So again, going back, when Jesus said, like the days of Noah, they weren't simply just thinking, oh, well, people were unaware. People were, building and planting, even though that's all true. They were thinking in terms of supernatural intervention into humanity genetically and other things. It was complete chaos That is what the first century person would have thought of.